RUSI New South Wales is an independent, apolitical, not-for-profit public education institute that, since 1888, has been promoting informed debate on and enhancing public awareness and understanding of defence and national security issues. We are Australia's oldest think tank. We conduct monthly lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, provide research support through our extensive military and historical library located in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney's Hyde Park, and together with RUSI Australia, publish a national quarterly magazine called United Service, with informed articles addressing the latest defence and security issues.
Please note, this monthly update presents the geostrategic situation as at the 9th of February 2026. Please be aware that these reports are time-sensitive as these are rapidly changing events. The Critical Importance of the Luzon Straits by Paul Burnard. The Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines is a strategic flashpoint and may become one of the most hotly contested areas if China moves against Taiwan. In the middle of the strait, the Bataan Islands is fast becoming vital terrain. At dawn on the 8th of December, 1941, Japan landed a small task force of 490 naval infantry and occupied the town of Basco and its small airfield on Bataan Island. Within hours, fighter aircraft were operating in support of landings in northern Luzon. The attack was unopposed and was timed to coincide with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The capture of Bataan Island was the first U.S. territory to fall to Japan and the first Philippine land to be occupied. 86 years later, the Bataan Islands are a focus for Philippine, U.S. and Chinese strategic interests. The Luzon Strait is 250 kilometers long and stretches from the northern Luzon coast to the southern tip of Taiwan. The northern section of the strait is the Bashi Channel, a major international shipping route and the route for numerous submarine communications channels. The channel is 2,400 kilometers deep and is vital for the Chinese Navy, as it is a key exit point for SSBNs and SSNs moving from the South China Sea to Pacific waters. Just north of the Luzon coast, the Babayan and Balintang channels are shallow by comparison and likely too difficult for submarine operations. The Bataan Islands form Bataan's province. Marvelous, also known as Yami, marks the southern edge of the Bashi Channel and is 144 kilometers from the southern tip of Taiwan. The capital of the province, Basco, has a population of 20,000 and the province is one of the poorest and least populated in the country and is known for its challenging weather. Philippine control of the Bashi Channel would deny Chinese surface vessels and aircraft access to the east coast of Taiwan, the southern approaches to Japan, as well as blocking a key egress point, and is now recognized as being a critical part of the first island chain that stretches from Japan, through Taiwan, to the southern part of the Philippines. The U.S. has worked with the Philippines to operationalize defense cooperation under the 1951 U.S.-Philippine Military Defense Treaty, using the Balikatan, shoulder-to-shoulder, exercise series to expand cooperation. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, was signed in 2014 and expanded in 2023, granting approval for joint training, prepositioning of equipment, construction of bases and airfields, and access to a number of key sites including on the North Luzon coast. Exercise Balikatan 25 placed emphasis on the Bataan's island group and saw the U.S. deploy sea denial missiles to Bataan. Philippine Navy, PN, Rear Admiral Roy Trinidad said, "It just so happens that we are the tollgate between the South China Sea and the Pacific." In August 2025, the PN and the Philippine Marine Corps, PMC, opened a new forward operating base, FOB, at Mahatao on Bataan Island, which is available to U.S. forces through the EDCA agreement. The FOB now allows the PMC to maintain a permanent presence on Marvelous Island. The 2025 exercise saw elements of the U.S. Marine Corps, USMC, 3rd Marine Division and the Army's 25th Infantry Division working with the PMC's Marine Battalion Landing Team 10. The exercises in northern Luzon and the Bataan Islands rehearsed maritime key terrain security operations and expanded base operations. The U.S. first deployed surface missile systems to Bataan in 2023, and since then a variety of anti-ship systems have deployed during exercises. From October 2023, the PN has operated a Maritime Domain Awareness, MDA, site on Marvelous Island covering the Bashi Channel. The Philippines acquired the Indian BrahMos supersonic anti-ship cruise missile system in 2022, which can cover the strait. A newly purchased Israeli radar system covers the air gap to Taiwan. A possible data sharing agreement with Japan would give the Philippines access to Japan's radar network in the Ryukyu Islands, while giving Japan access to data covering the Luzon Strait. China has watched these developments closely. In June 2025, the Shandong Aircraft Carrier Group transited the Bashi Channel, and in August 2025, the Philippine government noted enhanced grey zone operations, which the Philippines, based on its experience in the South China Sea, now defines as illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive (ICAD) activities in the Exclusive Economic Zone (EEZ) near Batan's. Manila has been frank about the implications of Chinese military action against Taiwan, and the Batan's Islands are a critical part of contingency plans for the evacuation of 200,000 Philippine citizens escaping from Taiwan, plus the inevitable refugee outflow. Philippine political and military leaders are now referring to the Batan's Islands as the spearhead of the Philippines. Australia is also assisting the Philippines. Exercise Alon, Wave 25 was conducted in August 2025 in the Western Philippine Sea area and involved 1,600 troops, HMAS Brisbane, and a large RAAF contingent. The Luzon Strait, in particular the Bashi Channel, is of critical strategic importance. The considerable enhancement of the defence of the Batan's Islands presents a challenge to China. The Philippines is making considerable progress in building capability to both defend and deny the strait. But like 1941, will the Batan's Islands be part of the opening shots of a Chinese campaign against Taiwan? New START Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty expires by David Leece. The New START Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty between Russia and the United States expired on the 4th of February, 2026. The treaty's formal name was Measures for the Further Reduction and Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. It was signed on the 8th of April, 2010 in Prague, and after ratification it entered into force on the 5th of February, 2011. It was subsequently extended to the 4th of February, 2026. The treaty placed verifiable limits on all intercontinental range nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Russian Federation met the central limits of the New START Treaty by the 5th of February, 2018, and had stayed at or below them since then. Those limits were 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, deployed submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. 1550 nuclear warheads on deployed ICBMs, deployed SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. Each such heavy bomber is counted as one warhead toward this limit, and 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launchers, SLBM launchers, and heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. New START was the last of a web of arms control arrangements negotiated between the US and Russia following the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is considered the closest the world ever came to international nuclear war. This web of arrangements was intended to reduce the chance of an international nuclear exchange. With the expiry of New START, there are now no controls on the US and Russia developing nuclear weapons. It is understood that Russia was prepared to renew New START for a further 12 months, but the Trump administration was not interested in extending the treaty. It was concerned that the arrangements did not include China. China, for its part, has indicated that it is not prepared to consider nuclear arms controls until its nuclear stockpile catches up to those of Russia and the US. The US and Russia are now expected to refresh and modernize their nuclear stockpiles, and many seasoned observers are concerned that this may lead to a new arms race. Comments on the US National Defense Strategy 2026 by Paul Burnard. Do note that these views reflect those of the author and do not necessarily represent the views of RUSI NSW. United States Secretary for War, Pete Hesketh, released the 2026 National Defense Strategy, NDS, on January 23. The 34-page document projects a theme of restoring peace through strength for a new golden age of America. The role of the NDS is to provide the foundational document for U.S. strategic planning, resource allocation, and force planning, and is meant to be the key enabler for the National Security Strategy, NSS, launched by President Trump in December. The NDS marks a major shift in grand strategy terms from Europe to the Asia-Pacific, with defense priorities moved from integrated deterrence to a hierarchy of priorities. 4 key themes define the US's effort in the coming years. Homeland defense and hemispheric dominance are the highest priority, followed closely by the need to deter China, but through strength rather than confrontation, and increased burden sharing with allies and partners is now central to strategic planning. The 4th priority is to supercharge the US defense industry. On China, the US wants stable peace based on respectful relations ultimately managed directly by contact between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, with the US intent on negotiating from a position of strength. Strategic stability will be enhanced through a wider range of military-to-military contacts. The NDS states that the aim is for the US not to dominate or humiliate China, but to avoid China achieving regional domination. While the US will be willing to de-escalate and deconflict it, will erect a strong denial defense along the First Island Chain, FIC. This is a key message for regional allies in the Asia-Pacific, with partners urged to contribute more to collective defense. The NDS states, "We will be strong, but not necessarily confrontational." The NDS places particular emphasis on burden sharing, with the US rejecting isolationism but looking to allies and regional partners to assist with deterring China. The NDS states that allies are expected to spend 3.5% of GDP on core military spending and a further 1.5% on security-related spending, totaling 5% of GDP. This level of expenditure is deemed essential if the US and allies are to meet simultaneous threats and is essential to a lasting peace. What might this mean for Australia? The NDS is unequivocal that allies must commit to spending 5% on defence. This has significant implications for Australia, South Korea, and Japan, and at some point, we can expect pressure to be applied. The NDS marks a major shift in strategy from Europe to Asia. Trump's view that Russia is best contained by all countries in Europe spending 5% on defence will be an ongoing theme. Deterring China will take place in the First Island Chain. Australia's defence cooperation with Japan and the Philippines are now of vital importance, and such things as exercises and capacity building are central to our grand strategy. The NDS emphasis on burden sharing states that the more minor challenges must be met by local partners. Thus, North Korea is foremost a South Korean problem, Russia is a European challenge, and Iran is a Middle East problem. It follows that the US expects Australia to be able to handle strategic and security challenges in the Southwest Pacific. The NDS rejects what it calls cloud castle abstractions like the rules-based international order. For the US, the armed forces are now about winning wars and providing credible deterrence. AUKUS was not specifically mentioned, but the strategic goal of reviving the US defense industrial base through new technologies and harnessing the potential of AI will impact submarine production. The NDS makes no specific reference to the US nuclear umbrella that underpins the treaty relationships with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The omission may be intended to be non-confrontational and tailor language directed at a Chinese audience, but it is an issue that will be fundamental to the drafting of Australian strategic planning documents this year. Greenland by David Leece. In the January 2026 Geostrategic update, I summarised the geostrategic importance of Greenland today and traced the history of the island and those who have sought to own it over the last 1,000 years. January 2026 was Greenland's warmest January on record. It experienced a rate of warming 4 times faster than the global average, redrawing the outlook for industries from fishing to mining, enhancing the attractiveness of the southern Arctic Sea route, the Northwest Passage, for shipping, and, hence increasing Greenland's geostrategic significance. You will recall that the United States has been interested in purchasing Greenland from Denmark since the 1860s, making formal bids, each rejected, in 1868, 1917 and 1946. The US, however, was permitted to develop military bases on Greenland during World War II and was permitted to retain them post-war. The 1951 agreement between the United States of America and the Kingdom of Denmark concerning the defense of Greenland allowed the US to construct and operate strategic bases under the NATO framework to protect the North Atlantic. The Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, on the northwest coast is the sole US military base still operating in Greenland. President Trump, from the start of his second term as President of the US in January 2025, has put great pressure on Denmark to sell Greenland to the US and has hinted that if he does not get Greenland through diplomacy, then he may take it by force, this despite Denmark being an ally of the US and a fellow member of NATO. Denmark, in response, again has said unequivocally that Greenland is not for sale. Beginning on the 4th of January, 2026, Trump began an intense 3-week campaign to bully Denmark into selling Greenland. On the 4th of January, President Trump said, "We do need Greenland, absolutely. We need it for defense, it's so strategic." The Prime Ministers of Denmark and Greenland immediately pushed back strongly. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said, "I have to say this to the United States. It makes absolutely no sense to talk about the need for the United States to take over Greenland." She pointed out that Denmark was a US military ally and that the US had extensive access to Greenland. At the same time, behind the scenes, Prime Minister Frederiksen began rallying her NATO and European allies, in effect forming her own coalition of the willing. On the 6th of January, the leaders of France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and Denmark issued a joint statement saying, "Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. The leaders said security in the Arctic must be achieved collectively with NATO allies, including the United States. NATO has made clear that the Arctic region is a priority and European allies are stepping up. On the 8th of January, US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, emphasized that the US was determined to acquire Greenland. It is understood that the US administration at that point was considering three options: purchase from Denmark, military seizure, and a so-called Compact of Free Association, an agreement under which Greenland would become independent in exchange for granting the US authority over its defense and foreign affairs. On the 16th of January, several European NATO allies, including Germany, France, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, started sending troops to Greenland at Denmark's request. These initial deployments were reported to be reconnaissance and planning teams for what was to become a permanent NATO presence. Faced with this wall of European resistance, in his speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, on the 21st of January, Trump walked back his demands. He said he had met with the NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, and discussed an outline of means by which Trump could achieve his core objectives without gaining ownership of Greenland. These would now be the subject of detailed negotiations. Mette Frederiksen, Jens Frederik Nielsen, Prime Minister of Greenland, and their European allies had won this round. Trump, however, made clear that he would not forget those who had opposed him. Little has been reported of the negotiations since Trump's backdown. It is understood that Trump is asking for more US bases in Greenland and for sovereignty over the land that US bases occupy. Both the Danish and Greenlandic prime ministers, however, have made clear that ceding sovereignty over any of Greenland is a red line they will not cross. The outcome of these negotiations is likely to be enshrined in a revision of the 1951 US-Danish Agreement on the Defense of Greenland. The Situation in Yemen by David Deasey. During the month, Saudi-backed forces completed their consolidation of control in southern Yemen. There is some thought that they are gearing up for a renewed offensive against the Houthi North, which has been dormant for some time. The Houthis, however, have not been idle. On Saturday, the 31st of January, Houthi militia carried out a violent offensive against the city of Tariz, a city to the north of Aden. The assault was said to be accompanied by heavy gunfire and artillery exchanges. There were reports that Houthi snipers were deliberately and indiscriminately targeting non-combatants in crowded residential areas, creating fear amongst the civilian population. This was perhaps an attempt to drive them out. This is reminiscent of the situation in Bosnia in the 1980s. It is not clear whether this assault is a new phase of the war, a response to the perceived chaos of the official Yemeni government, or merely an attempt to get onto the front foot against a revived Saudi-led offensive. The civilian casualties and the general chaos threaten a humanitarian crisis. On this latter issue, the United Nations has its own problems. UN activities and humanitarian relief have been based in the north at the old capital of Sana'a, which is now the Houthi capital. It may be that this is a matter of principle, arguing that the UN should not be hostage to changed national considerations. The Houthis, however, have become suspicious of UN activity due to the precise nature of previous Israeli attacks and have arrested many UN workers. In the past few weeks, the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, Julian Harnias, has reported that the Houthis have entered at least 6 unstaffed UN offices in Sana'a and removed most of the telecommunication equipment and several UN vehicles. Again, it is not clear whether this is a further punitive act or harassment against the UN personnel or merely an opportunistic theft. It is likely that it is the former. In any event, the move will hamper urgently needed humanitarian assistance in Houthi-controlled areas and appears to be a deliberate escalation against the UN. Separately, an American policy report has recommended that all UN operations in the Yemen be relocated, arguing that there would be greater accessibility in delivering aid and coordinating international support. The UN has some serious issues to consider, and it may be forced into structural change that it wishes to avoid, but it can't have it both ways. Finally, it is estimated that up to 400 young Yemeni men have been lured by Russian promises of jobs, money, and escape from poverty, only to end up serving in the Russian army in Ukraine. It is a familiar story, and supposedly many want out of their predicament. This in fact represents human trafficking. Russo-Ukrainian War by David Leece. This month, the war will enter its 5th year since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The 2025-26 winter in Ukraine so far has been the coldest since the war began, with temperatures regularly falling to -10 degrees Celsius and at times to -23 degrees Celsius to -25 degrees Celsius in some areas. This has impacted both the fighting at the eastern and southern fronts and living conditions for civilians in the cities and countryside. The latter have been exacerbated by damaged energy infrastructure, which has led to widespread power, heating, and water outages. Over the past month, there have been continuing attempts by the United States to broker a peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine. Following pushback by Ukraine and its European supporters on President Trump's initial, the 20th of November, 2025, 28-point peace plan which strongly favored Russia, US negotiators led intense negotiations with Ukraine and the European bloc. A revised 20-point plan resulted. The 20-point plan was discussed by Presidents Trump and Zelensky at Mar-a-Lago on the 28th of December, 2025. Following the meeting, Trump said one or two thorny issues remained. The thorny issues apparently included as security guarantees offered by the US to ensure Russia does not renew its offensive into Ukraine at some future time. Russia's demand that Ukrainian forces withdraw from those parts of Donetsk Oblast which Russia so far has failed to capture, including from the so-called Donetsk Fortress Belt, and the future management of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The vexed issue of security guarantees was also discussed at a summit of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris on the 6th of January, 2026, which this time included United States. At the meeting, the US for the first time made binding commitments to support Ukraine if Russia attacks again. The security guarantees would enter into force in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. On the 6th of February, however, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov again rejected any meaningful security guarantees that would protect Ukraine from complete diplomatic or military capitulation. Little further progress on other key issues has been made, although trilateral talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the US are finally underway. A second round of these talks began in Abu Dhabi on the 4th of February. So far, the talks have led to another exchange of prisoners, but there has been no progress on the substantive issues, especially territorial ones. The evidence strongly suggests that President Putin is not interested in peace at this time. He is engaging in these talks largely to humor Trump. He is making demands that he knows Ukraine cannot accept. He wants all of the Donbass industrial region, which consists of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, plus Crimea, and a broad land bridge through the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts along the north shore of the Sea of Azov, linking Russia and the Donbass to Crimea. Putin's forces now occupy most of this territory, save for a vital part of western Donetsk, namely the so-called Donetsk Fortress Belt of cities and towns north of Pokrovsk. Analysts suggest that to seize the Fortress Belt militarily could take the Russians 1 or 2 years. In exchange for a ceasefire, Putin wants Ukraine to abandon the Fortress Belt and to retire west to the Donetsk border. While peace talks continue, Putin says he is happy to continue the fighting. If he is not given the rest of Donetsk through negotiation, then he will take it by force. On the battlefield, a strategic stalemate still pertains while attritional warfare continues along the whole 1,200 kilometers front line. A key Russian focus has been the city of Pokrovsk, a major logistics hub in western Donetsk Oblast, which provides the right flank protection to the Donetsk Fortress Belt. It has been largely destroyed and abandoned, except for Ukrainian defenders. On the 3rd of December, Russian troops reached the center of Pokrovsk, but since then they have been unable to dislodge the Ukrainian defenders from the city's north and west or cut off their supply lines. By the 4th of February, Russian forces had captured Burnard, a town immediately northeast of Pokrovsk, putting further pressure on the city's remaining defenders. So, while it has appeared for 2 months that the 21-month-long battle for Pokrovsk had entered its endgame, the defense seems remarkably resilient. At the same time, further north during December, the Russians also struggled on their Luhansk axis of advance. An advance on Kupiansk failed and the Ukrainians pushed back Russian forces while encircling several hundred others. Since then, Russian forces have struggled to make significant advances in the area, and they have struggled similarly in the south in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. On the 6th of February, 2026, it was reported that Russia has begun preparing its limited strategic reserves for a planned summer offensive, which may begin as soon as late April on the southern and/or eastern fronts. Observers, however, doubt that Russia has sufficient reserves to achieve any such offensive's objectives. Accompanying the slow grind on the battlefield, Putin is continuing his nightly drone and missile intimidatory and harassing attacks on Ukrainian cities and vital infrastructure. In fact, he has weaponized the fierce winter by attacking electricity generation and distribution infrastructure, leaving civilians in cities and towns throughout Ukraine without light and heating as nighttime temperatures fall to as low as -20 degrees Celsius or lower. Ukraine also has mastered the art of long-range drone and missile attacks on Russian cities and strategic infrastructure. Russia reported on the 5th of January that Ukraine had targeted Moscow with drones every day so far in 2026, and on the 4th of January, 3 of Moscow's 4 airports had to shut due to Ukrainian drone activity. Nevertheless, with the war about to enter its 5th year, a strategic stalemate on the battlefield, and no sign of a peace agreement on the horizon, Moscow is positioned logistically for a prolonged confrontation, relying on a war-adapted economy, support from partners like North Korea, Iran, and China, and a large mobilization base to sustain high casualties. Russia aims to win a war of attrition, believing its larger resources will eventually exhaust Ukraine's capacity to fight.